right. Hello, chums. Hello, pals. Hang on, let me just do one last thing. Good to see you. Tad here. I will be reading from now, or, well, when I start, till roughly 8 o'clock. Hope you are well. It is Sunday evening here in Northern California. We call it Northern, although really it's about halfway up the state, but that shows you with what disdain Southern California considers the northern part of the state. It's like, okay, we'll concede that there is some small smattering of civilization in the middle of the state around San Francisco, but everything above that is just nothing, which is not true, of course. Northern California is beautiful, beautiful place, full of interesting towns and cities and cool people and all kinds of things. Anyway, not that you should care unless you live there, in which case caring is fine. Hello, good to see you. What's going on? Anything? Well, as you can see, I'm still living in office squalor, but the rest of the house is doing better. I won't go into long details. I know it's all very personal. It's all very much just trying to get things normal again. I am working, as aforementioned. I said last night that I was back to working on Ordinary Farm 3, which is almost finished, or at least the first draft is almost finished. I hope to have that knocked out in a couple of weeks at the most. And then I will have still page proofs for Navigator's Children and a few other things. But other than that, I will soon be able to start working on the next book. And there is a next book, which I think I've mentioned a few times, called The Splintered Sun. And it is another book set in Ostenard, although it is not going to be quite such a gigantic thing as my trilogies. It'll be somewhere in between the length of one of those long ones and the length of one of the really short ones, like Brothers of the Wind or the Heart of What Was Lost. I won't know until I start it what the sort of size of it is, but it's meant to be the first book of maybe a series, if it works, which is going to be more of a classical series rather than one of my very large single novels broken up into 3 or 4 gigantic tree-killing volumes, but will be more like a normal length of book, and I hope to keep them coming if people like it. If people like it. And that's, of course, one of the key things about any kind of, for lack of a better term, commercial art, which is what I do, which is that, if you're going to make your living off of something, you have to make sure that you make something that people want to pay for. So that's what I will be doing. That is not a complaint, by the way. I never set out to write pure art any more than most artists or writers do, in the sense that I wanted to be able to make a living doing it, which is why I chose to write, say, for instance, in a genre that I loved, which is fantasy and science fiction, the whole kind of larger genre, because I wanted to know there was an audience out there for the kind of thing I wanted to do. And I figured if I did things that were not unlike the things that I had loved, there was a chance that I could find readers. And so far, so good. It could all still collapse in moments. Don't get me wrong, but at this point in time, although as I've mentioned in the past, I have occasionally said, "What was I thinking getting into writing fiction, as opposed to films or games or something that just booming and hugely profitable, and basically anything will get snapped up and made." But the thing is that I am a reader, and that was a huge part of what shaped me as a person. Huge. I mean, I cannot possibly find a way to sum it up easily. From the time that I was first being read to, and as those of you who've looked at my books fairly closely know, my mom read to me when I was little, because I'm quite a few years older than my brothers. And that had a very big effect on me. And it was particularly the kinds of things that my mom read to me were, stuff like The Wind in the Willows, the Winnie the Pooh books, all that stuff when I was young. And so there's always been that touch of the fantastical, that touch of kind of elevated childhood reading in what I do. And I'm not only not ashamed of it, I think some of the most important writing that has ever been done. I'm not saying me, but I'm saying in general, I think some of the most important writing that's ever been done in our language or any language is the kind of stuff that grabs you when you're at that between age. And, you know, obviously The Lord of the Rings, I read it first when I was 11 years old. And over the years, continued to read it and reread it. And that's why it was so amusing to me when I came to write the second long set of Ostenard books and realized that I had friends out there who had read my books the exhaustive way that I read Tolkien when I was young. And that they knew my created world better than I did, just as probably well, I don't know about Tolkien. He probably knew it better than anybody, but that was because he held stuff back and it only came out over the years. But anyway, so I always wanted to write this kind of stuff. I wanted to write the kind of fiction that both expanded what was possible, which is the fantastic part of it, but also, I hoped, would hit people in terms of real life stuff too. You know, what it means to be a human being, what it means to grow up, what it means to have a different view of the society you grew up in as you get older and things change. All kinds of things that are relevant to people of any age. So it wasn't like I went, oh, I want to write fun books for kids. It was that I happened to think this is a genre or a type of literature that you can do both. You can have fun. You can say, as I did in the Otherland books, you know, I want a giant monster to chase my characters, but at this point in time, dinosaurs are just so done, because this was just when Jurassic Park was coming out. So, you know, what could I use instead? How about a giant praying mantis? Yeah, that would be super cool. So there is that aspect of the work, too, which is that I get to indulge things that I love and I'm really fascinated by. And I mentioned this last night when I was talking about, you know, my thematic obsessions that keep coming up and coming up and coming up. Underground journeys, lost cities, all these kinds of things that have fascinated me ever since I was little, even though I don't necessarily always know why. They're not, you know, there's not necessarily a key thing that I went, this is what I will do from now on, or even just like, oh, I'm scarred for life, I'll have to keep working through this. It was more just things that really interested me and that tingled me, for lack of a better term. So, you know, that's kind of what led me along this path. But I never wanted to write just that. I love that part of it. But as somebody who, I always loved The Lord of the Rings, but as I've said many times before, and I won't go into in depth here, I had a lot of criticism for the people who followed Tolkien, I thought rather blindly, did not understand that Tolkien had made choices based on his personal interests and cares and things that upset him or whatever worried him about his society. That it was not, you know, this was not biblical writ. This, you know, The Lord of the Rings was not, okay, this is how all fantasy must be. It was a very personal thing. Tolkien said himself that, you know, at least when he set out to write it, he was trying to write a sort of a national epic of Northern Europe. That was kind of, you know, of England and Northern Europe, and that was kind of what he wanted to do. So he had big plans. He was not just trying to write a cute little adventure story, but he was also doing all the, you know, bringing into it all the things that he loved and he cared about, and obviously languages, because he was a professor of philology at Oxford. But that was not the only thing. And you see his Catholicism, and you see his respect for the earlier societies and civilizations that led to ours, and you saw his hatred of war and all kinds of things, because of course he'd been in the First World War, and his son then, who edited the later books, was in the Second World War. So there's a number of things, and that's what I wanted to do, not to imitate Tolkien's books, but to follow in those footsteps of trying to make something real out of the fantastical. And I think that's the goal of most good writers in our part of the field. It is not simply to keep scratching the same itch over and over again, but is to take something in the human condition and cast it in our world of the fantastic and use that difference between our world and the fantastical invented world to look at things in a different way, with a different focus or a different angle of light being brought to it. So, having said all of that, which I hope made some kind of sense, I am going to check up and see who has checked in. Of course, it says I've only got 6 comments. I can only see 4, but there seem to have been many more than that based on the list of people. So I will say hello to everybody. So at least the ones who are on this list. Hello, Angie. Good to see you. Ivan. Hi, buddy. Jeremy, you too. Good to see you. Elliot. Hello, Elliot. Ray Weatherford. Good to see you, Ray. Kelly, as always, a pleasure. Barb Ann, same. Tracy. Hello, Tracy. Good to see you too. And Emily. And Claudia. And Isaac. And Chris. That's Chris Van Dahl. Medardo, senor. Good to see you too. I hope I got back. Oh, I guess maybe I haven't gotten back to you. Anyway, Medardo. Perdóname. I'm going to have to get back, but I'm sure I have a useful reply for you. So apologies for not having gotten back. It's been a crazy week. We've had people ripping things out and putting things in, and anyway. So who else? Mark. Hello, Mark. Good to see you, buddy. Christy. Hello, Christy. And Susan. And there's Kristen. Kristen has showed up. Okay, I think that's most of the folk that have checked in. So again, I left my magic mirror in the other room, in my other trousers. But I do feel like Miss Nancy from Romper Room. And when I say that to the European folks who are listening at 1 in the morning, 1 in the morning my time, they often are, I think, slightly puzzled, unless they lived somewhere for a while where there was a romper room. And I'm sure younger readers are just absolutely, they don't know what that is at all, because, of course, that thing was, I guess it ran through until like my younger brother, who is Gen Z. No, Gen X, sorry. I always mess the generations up because they're so arbitrary. But until my younger brother grew up, I think that was still on the air. So that was into the 70s, I guess, or the late 60s, 70s. So I realize it's an obscure reference, but it is so accurate. It feels so like it, when she used to hold her mirror and do that thing and pretend to say hello to all the people she could see in her magic mirror. I'm sure for a lot of kids that was like an important moment, that they had heard their name on television, even if they had never actually made any contact, because I think she probably they just picked names out of a hat most of the time and just, said, I see Jimmy and Susan and Catherine and Freddie and, whatever, just picking names. But I'm sure it was very powerful, and I'm sure that for some kids, for instance, I never heard her say, and I see Tad, but that was okay. I wasn't one of those kids who needed it. But I'm sure there were kids out there who felt seen by hearing their name and thinking, little kids, thinking, Miss Nancy from Romper Room actually saw me. And then some of them probably had the the concomitant frightening thought, oh my God, can she see me all the time? Or only when she's doing the beginning of the show? Anyway. All right, so with that, I think I am going to cross over to the world of books, and specifically the world of reading. What was happening last night, or early this morning, was the wedding of Framer's sister, Culva, to his brother, Odrig, who is the clan Thane of the Crane clan, Crane, C-R-A-N-E, Crane, the bird. So Fremer, who we've met several times, hanging out with Unver, Framer's sister, Culva, was being given in marriage to a man named Drojan, who we all kind of got the impression that she wasn't super crazy about, but she was a woman of her culture, and she was going to go along with it, even though she was fairly miserable. And so the wedding had just started out in a paddock somewhere, with all the setup and special tents and all the religious observances, when Unver showed up drunk at the wedding. He had found out in one of our earlier readings that Kulva, whom he apparently had a thing for, was being married off to Drojan. So Unver shows up, is drunk and denouncing the wedding. During the course of the wedding, the course of this argument, finds out that Odrig, Fremer's brother, Kulva's brother, the Thane, Odrig had actually had the horses that Unver was going to use as a bride price for Kulva, and that his stepfather had sold them to Odrig. And of course, Unver was even more unhappy about that. Drojan attacked him. Unver fought with him. At first it was just wrestling until Drojan pulled a knife. Then Drojan was killed. After that, Odrig stepped in and turned it into a sword fight. And that's where we were, and we went through the whole sword fight, and I'm going to pick up just the very end of that, and then we will go from there. Oops, sorry, I got to go back a little bit further. Okay. At the sound of several loud clangs in succession, he looked up. Unver was in a half crouch, doing his best to slip Odrig's heavy strokes. Clearly, the Thane, that's Odrig, meant to end this. The sun beat down, and the grass sparkled with wet scarlet. Unver had several more wounds, so many that it was hard to count them in the general mire of his bloodied clothing. Then, just as Odrig drew back for a better killing angle, Unver leaped up at him with what must have been his final strength and swung at his head. Odrig guided the blow away easily with his own blade and then turned his sword over, trapping Unver's weapon. But the sound of their two weapons striking each other seemed so odd and muffled that even Odrig, the path of his death stroke now open, hesitated for a moment to glance at the blade he had turned aside. It was not Unver's sword that had swung toward the Thane's head and was now imprisoned by the grip of Odrig's own blade. It was Unver's scabbard, torn loose from his belt. His sword was still in his other hand. Odrig had only a moment to gape. Then, even as the realization of what he was seeing drained the blood from his face, Unver plunged his own curved blade into Odrig's belly so hard that its point tented the back of his feast day garment. The ending came so suddenly and so surprisingly that none of the guests even cried out. Odrig's knees went limp. He collapsed onto Unver, who held him up for a moment, his own legs shaking, then stepped out of the way and let the Thane fall into the mud. Unver, bloody and silent, walked toward Fremer. The guests between them nearly flew in their hurry to get out of his way, but the tall man did not seem to see them, as though he passed living through the land of shadows. When he reached Fremer, he said nothing but only bent and lifted Kulva's body out of her brother's grasp. Unver was exhausted, and the dead weight of her made him stagger, but he managed to put her over his shoulder. Then, still without a word, he turned and walked across the paddock, two bodies left lying in the grass behind him, and the clan guests shrinking back as if from a leper. He walked unsteadily toward the gate that led out of the paddock, Kulva bouncing on his shoulder, her hair unbound now, and waving behind him like a horse's tail. For long moments, no one around the wedding tent said anything, but only watched Unver's diminishing figure. "Don't let him go!" someone shouted at last. "He killed the Thane!" "Murderer!" someone else cried, and there was a general roar of agreement, mostly from the men. A few guests near Fremer drew their swords to go after Unver, startling Fremer as though from a sudden dream. The anger that had bubbled inside him was still hot, but now felt hard as stone. He pulled his own blade and slapped the nearest man on the arm with it, hard enough to make him drop his weapon. "What are you doing?" the man snarled. It was Gejdan Baldhead, one of the friends who had been drinking with Drojan and Odrig only an hour before, his face bright pink with astonishment and thwarted anger. "We must catch the half-blood before he gets to his horse." "No." Fremer held his sword out sideways in front of Gejdan and the others, like a paddock gate. He felt curiously clear-headed, as if he alone had stood soberly by while everyone else had drunk themselves into madness. Get out of my way, Fremer Mouse, Gejdan snarled, or you'll get the same thing. Fremer placed the point of his own curved sword against the man's chest. You will do nothing. Odrig is dead. My brother, the Thane, is dead. That means I am Thane of the Crane clan until we choose another at the next clan moot. Do you deny the law? Gejdan stared at him, anger fighting surprise, as if the Fremer he knew had disappeared and been replaced by some strange demon from another world. You? I am eldest male of Odrig's house. That means I am Thane. But he stole your sister's body, cried another man. He will shame her. He will not shame her. He will mourn her, you fool, and then he will bury her. We have time enough to think about what Unver has done. Put up your swords. If you want to bury someone, you have 2 corpses right here. You do not know what you are doing, Gejdan said, but after staring at Fremer for a moment, he slid his blade back into the sheath. Fremer felt as if his own face must be shining. He felt so hot beneath his skin. No, but neither do you, nor do any of the rest of us. A vision had come to him, even as he had drawn his sword, the fires of the stone-dweller settlement biting at the sky, and Unver looming above it all like some great hunting bird sent down from heaven to scourge the people's enemies. Do you not see? The gods have spoken to us today. The Sky Piercer has given us a great message, and we must understand it before we act. And although he saw nothing but anger from his brother's friends, he saw something else on the faces of many gathered there. Not merely confusion and horror, but also a kind of awe. Even old Burtan, the shaman, seemed chastened, as though he had witnessed not just something horrible, but something that was important as well. Fremer was glad to see the old man understood. The others might understand in time. Some never would, perhaps. That was what happened, his father had once told him, when the gods spoke to men. Chapter 40, Watching Like God. There once was a woman who lived in the sky, lived in the sky, lived in the sky. Something small but surprisingly heavy was bouncing on Morgan's chest, an evil fairy by the sound of its piping voice. There once was a woman who lived in the sky, and her name was Grandmother Sun. He groaned and tried to push it off, but it clung like a burr. She rode upon a cloudy horse, a cloudy horse, a cloudy horse. She rode upon a cloudy horse, and her name was Grandmother Sun. God's hell, he said, what are you? You said a cursing word against God, the fairy pointed out with obvious relish. I'm going to tell Archbishop Jervis, and he'll excommunicate you. Go away. Sleeping. You have to get up because you're going away today, Morgan. And I'm angry at you because you didn't come and say goodbye. He opened one eye. The light in his room was not sufficient to illuminate the shape perched atop him, but he had already identified the noxious spirit as his sister. How could I come and say goodbye when I haven't left yet? You were going to go away without even coming to say goodbye. He rolled Lilia off his chest and then draped an arm across her, pinning her down. I came to your room last night to do that because I thought we were leaving early, but you weren't there. How is that my fault? Because I had a bad dream. I went and got in bed with Auntie Roner. His younger sister had learned several years ago that her grandmother's friend was named Countess Rona, but as with many other matters, Lilia showed no interest in changing her ways to please others. Morgan had a stubborn streak of his own, but he was a mere journeyman of self-interest compared to his little sister's mastery of the craft. And I was supposed to know that? Besides, I don't think Auntie Roner would have wanted me climbing into bed with her too, Lil. No, because you're too big and you smell bad. Liar. You do.
You smell like Brother Olaf." He had tutored the children for a year until his habit of pilfering small objects for drinking money became too hard to overlook, and he was returned to St. Sutrin's Abbey. During his tutoring days, he had hidden jugs of wine in unlikely places around the residence so he could sneak out for a drink between lessons. Morgan rolled over, turning his back on his young sister. "Go away, pigling. I'm trying to sleep." "Get up! It's time to get up, and you have to say goodbye to me." "Goodbye." "No, proper. You have to get up and say it proper. Otherwise, it doesn't work." "What doesn't work?" "I said a special prayer this morning. It was a special one so that God would remember you were going away, and he would promise you'd come back safe." Morgan grunted. "Did he?" "Did he what?" "Did God promise you?" "I don't know. Don't be mean." She wasn't just half cross, the way she usually was when he was pretending to be difficult, or actually being difficult, which also happened fairly frequently. Morgan thought she sounded quite upset, close to tears. He groaned again and rolled onto his back, still pinning her as best he could so she didn't climb back on top of him. His young sister had a habit of straddling his chest and pretending he was a horse. A very frolicsome horse, to judge by her jouncing rides, but that felt worse than usual this morning, with his stomach still full of the previous night's cheap wine. In fact, Morgan hadn't stayed out terribly late or drunk terribly much, because he had thought that the company would be leaving at dawn. When he had returned to the residence after supper, he had learned about Count Aolair and their delayed departure, but he still didn't want Lilia thumping on his belly, hobbledehoy. "I suppose when I'm gone, your bouncy highness will have to put that pony out to pasture and get a real horse." His jest was met with silence. He looked over to where she lay, now nestled against his rib cage. Tears were spilling over and running down her cheeks. "Why are you crying, pigling?" "You know why. You know." "Because I'm going away." "Yes. Again, after you just came back." "It's not my idea. I don't care if you never grow to a man. I don't want you to go." "Grow to a man?" "That's what Auntie Roner said. She said he has to go out in the world and learn to be a man. That's what she said." Morgan frowned and began to lever himself into a sitting position, which entailed disentangling himself from an unhappy 7-year-old. Rona's words angered him, much as he liked the Hernesteri noblewoman. Why did everyone think he was such a failure at manhood? He could fight with a sword, ride a horse, drink with the best of them, and he had also had his share of doings with women as well. At the same age, his grandfather had been scouring bowls and pots in the castle kitchen. Was it Morgan's fault that there was no Storm King to force him to war, no Mad King Elias, no Red Priest Pryrates? Thinking of the Red Priest, he suddenly remembered what he thought he had seen in the tower. It came swift and strong enough for Lilia to notice. "If you're cold, get back under the blanket," she said. "We'll make a tent." No tent, pigling. I really do have to get up and get ready." At least, so he assumed. "What time is it?" 11 of the clock. "Damnation! You said another word against God." "I did not." "Come on, off me. Give me room to swing my legs." He put his feet down on the cold floor, swallowed another and even more florid curse. "You're sure it's 11? Not 10? Where's Melkin?" "He's gone to make certain all your gear is ready. That's what he said. He's the one who told me what time it was." Which meant it was true. Melkin was not the most gifted squire, but he nearly always knew the time. His life's great dream, he had once admitted to his lord the prince, was to have a clock of his own to tend. Morgan could imagine nothing more boring in all the lands of Ostenard than spending one's days up a tower tending a clock. "Go and get me something to eat, will you?" he asked his sister. "I'll wash and put on some clean clothes. I'm supposed to go see Mother. Oh, and Grandfather and Grandmother, too, before I leave. No doubt so they can Tell me again what an idle devil I am, and how this ride into the empty wilderness in search of fairies is going to put me right." Lilia gave him a searching stare. "Are you really going to visit the real true fairies?" "I suppose." It was much easier to sit up in bed when you hadn't been drinking all night. He had almost forgotten that. "If we ever find them, but they're not exactly fairies. You saw the woman upstairs, didn't you? Did you think she was a real true fairy?" "I did, Morgan. Her eyes were like a cat, and she was so very, very thin." "Well, we're taking her back to her people so they can try to make her better." "She should pray to God. That's what Father Nully says. God can make her better. But fairies don't pray to God. They don't even believe in God." "Well, then God probably won't cure her, so someone else will have to. You don't want her to die, do you?" Lilia's eyes got big. "Oh, no, that would be too bad." "That's why we're taking her back to her people, see? To get her some fairy medicine. And, speaking of magical things that make people feel better, what about some food? Grandfather said if you wanted something to eat before your journey, you should have come down to eat when everyone else was having theirs." "Grandfather would say that, yes." He scowled, then saw Lilia's offended expression. "But I'm sure he didn't mean nobody could go to the kitchen and see if anything was lying about. Just going to waste, if you see what I mean." She gave him another disapproving look. "That would be stealing." Morgan sighed. "Someday I am going to be the ruler of this place, and you will be a most important lady. All of this will belong to us." She stared, sensing a trick of some kind. "So? So if you find some food for me in the kitchen, it won't be stealing. I'll just be borrowing it from myself. You see that, don't you?" Her brow wrinkled, but at last she got up. "You won't lock the door like you always do while I'm gone, will you?" "No, but if you take too long, I'll be downstairs having an audience with grandfather and grandmother, so hurry." Lilia looked at him carefully, not quite sure he was telling the truth, but at last she turned and headed for the door. "You promise, remember, don't lock the door." "I won't. But hurry yourself, Pigling, I'm famished." For long moments after she had gone out, Morgan just sat on the edge of the bed, enjoying the quiet. But something was tugging at his heart. He was going to miss his sister, he realized, and the thought gave his heart a painful squeeze. He hadn't thought about it until now, but it was true. He was going to miss the castle, and the city too, of course, miss his friends and his favorite haunts, and even his mother and his grandparents, no matter what they thought of him. But most of all, he was going to miss that small and difficult girl. His mother, Princess Idela, was in her chambers with her circle of ladies, sewing and gossiping. Even before noon it was another hot day, and one of the younger chambermaids walked around them with a large fan, cooling them. Morgan kneeled and took Idela's cool hand, pressed it to his lips. "I give you good morning, Mother." "I am devastated," she announced, although she did not truly sound as if it were so. "I do not know what to say except that I will not rest until you've returned again, my dearest son. It should not be too long, or at least I hope not. Count Eolair said we should be back before the end of summer. Oh, and what a terrible thing that was. To think someone would try to harm him. That poor old man. How is the dear Count this morning?" Morgan clenched his teeth but smiled. "I don't know, Mother. I have not been downstairs yet. I came to say goodbye to you first." "What a good son." She turned, smiling, to her circle. "Can anyone wonder I will miss him so?" The ladies all nodded and murmured and smiled back at him. Some of the noblewomen who surrounded his mother were scarcely older than Morgan himself, But although many of them were pretty, they seemed oddly beyond his reach or even his understanding, as though they belonged to an alien race, like the Scytho woman he and Aolair were taking home. "I am as you have raised me, mother." Ah, she said, "I cannot take the blame for everything. Some of your adventures have more to do with the rough company you keep than anything I taught you." He tried to smile. "Perhaps. In any case, the others will be waiting for me downstairs. We are to leave soon if we are to make Woodsall by dark." His mother shook her head. "Oh, I hate to think of you traveling in the Aldhort, or even near it. That is a place of evil repute. Promise to say your prayers at morning and nightfall, no matter what happens, and keep the holy tree around your neck always. Promise." "I promise." "Good, because even in these days of peace, the devil is at work in the world. Here, I have a gift for you to take with you." She bent and felt carefully through the items in her sewing basket until she found it. It was a book of the Aedon, small but beautifully bound. "This was my own mother's," she said. "She gave it to me when she knew I would go away to Urchester to be married. She thought the city was a hive of sin, with robbers in every alley." "She wasn't far wrong." His mother let out a most surprising giggle. "I was never allowed to find out. You don't suppose a young bride-to-be like myself was permitted to roam the city, do you? Especially a duke's daughter. Not without guards and chaperones, at least." She sounded almost wistful. "It might have been exciting." She recovered the thread of her thought. "In any case, you must keep this with you at all times. It was made by the monks of St. Ystrins, and it will keep you safe. And you must promise me to read a little from it each day when you have finished your writing. Promise?" Morgan was beginning to lose track of all the things he was promising the women of his family. "Of course, mother." He took the book, then leaned forward. When she lifted her cheek to him, he kissed it. "Thank you. I will think of you whenever I see it." "Don't just look at it. Read it." She said it with a curiously powerful emphasis that he did not understand. "As I said, of course I will." He straightened up. "I really must go. Tell Count Aolair he must take good care of you. You are precious, and not just because you are the heir. You are precious to me." Morgan nodded, but he knew there was no threat in the world, not even a fire-breathing dragon or a company of Norns, that could ever make him tell Count Aolair to take good care of him because he was precious to his mother. He bowed to the ladies, who smiled and said quiet, gracious things. Then he kissed his mother's hand once more and went out. "Every morning, every night," she called after him. "I will," he called back. When he finally reached the sanctuary of the hall, he tucked the book of Aedon into his shirt under his jerkin. His grandmother's holy book. Was there some kind of a conspiracy among the women to make him a proper man, or to keep him from becoming one? Morgan couldn't guess. He found his grandfather in the throne hall, seated in his chair instead of on the royal throne, something Morgan always found confusing and irritating. What point was there to having a throne in the first place, let alone a legendary one, made from the bones of an actual dragon, if you never used it? "When I am king, I will never sit in anything else." A dark thought flitted across Morgan's mind. If it comes to be, that is, if the troll's fortune-telling was mistaken. Thinking of Snennek brought back the night atop Yeldon's tower. A part of him wanted to confess everything to his grandparents, the open hatch, the hairless specter in red, but it was all beginning to seem unreal, like a bad dream. Had he seen the phantom before he hit his head, or after he had stunned himself? And if he told the tale, he knew his grandfather would be even angrier. He would send men up the tower to open it up, and when they found nothing, the Hayholt would be full of laughing tales of Prince Morgan's ghost. In the light of day, he now felt more and more certain that the spectre must only have been bad air from the long sealed tower and the disorder of his own rattled brains. Still, a part of him wondered whether he should tell someone. His grandfather was talking to Count Aolair, who sat beside him in the queen's seat, a dispensation obviously given him because of the bandaged wound just beneath his collarbone. The great hall was otherwise empty, except for a few guards in the shadows, a strange emptiness for a room that was usually as active as a small city. "Ah, good, you're here," said the king when he saw him. "No, don't kneel, lad. Come here and join us." He turned back to the count. "And Tiamat and his lady are certain." Aolair smiled wearily. He was a bit wan, but looked otherwise hale. "Yes, they are certain. No one of the blows was more than a cut, bloody but mostly harmless." "Harmless? Not from that puddle of blood I saw in the forehall. A child could swim in it. You are lucky it happened here where your wounds could be tended." "Beg pardon, Majesty, Count Aolair," said Morgan, "but I have heard only a little of what happened. I am glad to see you well, though, my lord. Are you truly well enough to ride?" "It was only a shallow wound, praise the gods. It startled me more than anything, and the struggling has already made me light-headed. Today's and tomorrow's travel will be on good royal roads. I will be well." "What madman did this to you?" Aolair carefully shook his head. "A harnester man who had been working for some time in the castle bakehouse. He was quiet and kept to himself. Nobody heard him say anything against me or anyone else. He was in distress, and I tried to help him. I do not even know if it was only me he wished to harm. He could not have known when I would be coming." "Praise God you were spared," said Morgan. He would have liked an excuse to call off the journey, but not at the expense of a good old man like the Lord Steward. "Did you kill the man?" Aolair's laugh was rueful. "As I said, I was light-headed. It was all I could do to hold on to him and keep him from a vital blow until others heard me and came to help." "Well, I'm glad you're safe, and that it wasn't worse." "As are we all," said his grandfather. "Pasquales has been trying to find out what the fellow wanted, or whether he is simply moon-mad, and that's an end on it, but without luck." "I cannot believe it was anything planned," said Aolair. "Too slapdash. Just a madman babbling about being summoned. Perhaps he followed me here from our country with some insane grudge. Perhaps he simply fixed on me because I spoke Hernesteri to him." The count slowly rose from the chair. "With your permission, Majesty, I will leave you and the prince to say your goodbyes while I see to the last of the details." He turned to Morgan. "When the noon bells ring, Highness?" "I will be there." But Morgan was worrying now. What if Aolair was too weak to command the mission? Or what if he died along the way? He was quite old, after all. Then even more responsibility would fall on Morgan's own shoulders. And no doubt, if things went wrong, the blame would fall on him as well. "So, lad," said the king, "here we are. No, here you are, about to undertake a mission for the high throne. How does it feel?" Morgan knew what his grandfather wanted to hear, although he felt like a Hirka's dancing dog for giving it to him. "It feels like a great honor, Your Majesty." Any idea of telling the king what he thought he had seen on Yeldon's tower now sifted away like sand in an hourglass. If they did not even want him around, why would they care what he thought he saw? King Simon smelled the insincerity, catching Morgan by surprise. "Come, would you try to peddle me a branch of the Adon's execution tree? I asked you how it felt, not what you thought you should say." "Very well." Morgan didn't like being pulled up short even by the king. It feels as though you want to be rid of me, Your Majesty." His grandfather looked at him with surprise and hurt. "Do you really think that? Merciful Riap Morgan, do you truly think that?" "Why shouldn't I? You have done nothing but disapprove of me for longer than I can remember." He glanced around the nearly empty throne room. "Where's the queen?" "What?" "Where is my grandmother? Is she too ashamed to say goodbye to me? Or is she angry because you forced her into going along with the idea?" For a moment the king's face reddened, and the prince, full of righteous anger himself, braced himself for the bellowing to come. Instead, and now it was Morgan's turn to be surprised, the king forced a laugh and leaned back in his seat. "I had that coming, didn't I? No, the queen's not avoiding you. Your grandmother will be out to see you off. I just wanted to speak to you myself." "Well, then, you have. May I go?" The king's long face now clouded like a sky preparing to rain. "God's holy tree, boy, do you really think that of me? That I dislike you so?" "I didn't say that, but I think it's probably true. I said you disapproved of me, and you have said that yourself enough times. Do you take it back?" "No, damn it. But I don't disapprove of you, lad. I disapprove of what you've been doing. Tournaments, gambling, drinking, in and out of bawdy houses. Your only real friends, men twice your age, but half your wit. Let alone climbing around on that God-cursed tower in the middle of the night. Do you have any idea, young man, of the evil that's buried there? Any idea at all?" A chill squeezed Morgan's heart at the memory of a spectral, hairless head, but he was determined not to show it. "I've heard all the stories, sire. Gossip's tales to frighten children." He did not truly believe that after what he had seen, but admitting it in front of his grandfather would be like conceding that the old man was right about everything. "Gossip's tales, is it?" The king glowered. "Shall I tell you of what I saw the night I fled this castle, when I was no older than you? A man sacrificed, a high noble of this kingdom, his throat slit by white foxes, and his blood used to seal a pact between King Elias and the Storm King himself. And do you know who arranged that bargain? It was Pyrates, the man whose tower you so stupidly climbed." Morgan flinched. The thing was, the king was right. He had been stupid, but that didn't make hearing it any easier. "And what should I have feared?" he demanded. "Norns crawling out of the shadows with white-clawed hands to drag me to hell? The ghost of a mad priest? Or perhaps just a few rats? Old buildings have plenty of rats, they say, and their scratching is commonly mistaken for ghosts." His grandfather shook his head. "I was in that tower, boy, when Pyrates was still alive. If you had seen a quarter of what I saw, you would never dare make such a jest. Rats, if only. Blessed Elijah, please forgive this fool of a boy because he doesn't know any better." "If that's all you have to say to me, Your Majesty, then I might as well be on my way. With your permission, of course." For a moment they stayed that way, Morgan on one knee but poised to rise, his grandfather leaning forward on the second-best throne, pawing at his beard in frustration. "Well, then," the king said at last, "be on your way. But the day will come, I pray it will, anyway, when you will look back and realize that all your grandmother and I wanted was what was best for you. And on that day, I'll thank you, I'm sure." Morgan stood, barely able to hide the way his body was quivering with anger and sorrow and other feelings that had no names. "But now it seems to me that what you really want is me gone. Gone where I can't embarrass you any longer with my bad behavior and my dubious friends. In truth, none of you ever cared for me very much anyway. Not you, or my blessed mother, or even my father." His grandfather's face twisted into an expression that Morgan felt certain was fury, but he didn't care. Should he make the old man feel good for forcing him off on some bootless fool's errand? "Has a devil got into you, boy?" The king's hand trembled as he raised it, as if he tried to protect himself from something bad. "Bad enough you say such cruel things about the rest of us, who have cared for you so long. But your father, by the sacred blood of the ransomer, your poor father loved you." "Yes, I'm certain he did. For a time." He bowed stiffly. "I go now, at your order, Majesty." He turned and marched toward the door, waiting for King Simon to say something else. But he had fallen silent, doubtless too enraged to speak. It did not matter. His grandfather had won the argument simply by being the more powerful. There is no victory when you fight a king, Morgan thought, and did not look back as he left the throne room. Kings always win. But someday I will be the king. Lord Chancellor Passivales watched from the highest window of Holy Tree Tower as the prince's procession set out. He had planned to see Prince Morgan and the Hand of the Throne off on their journey, but when the time came, and to his surprise, he found himself awash in painful memories. It had been a bright, warm day when his own father and uncle had set out for Naban, having cast their lots with Prince Josua, Camarus, and the rest in the great Storm King's war. That long-ago day had been like this one in other ways, too, especially the mixture of pride, hope, and fear the crowd has felt as loved ones set out into the unknown. As a child, he had cheered without reservation, thrilled that his uncle, Baron Saradin, and his father, Brindales, were off to do a splendid thing on behalf of splendid people. After all, if Sir Camarus himself, the greatest warrior of his age, or perhaps any age, had turned up after all hope was past, then how could their cause fail? And it had not failed. In fact, right here in the Hayholt, they had sent the undead Storm King back to hell and defeated his mortal lackeys, King Elias and his warlock priest, Pryrates. But that did not mean that all those who fought against them had survived to enjoy the victory. Passivales' father and uncle would never see their home again, and with them gone, the fabric of his life had begun to fall apart. All his childhood, Passivales had devoured stories of heroism and knightly ideals, but after his father's death, those stories no longer made sense. It was not only people that had died in the Storm King's war. Passivales stared down at the tide of men on foot and horseback, preparing to make their way out of the middle bailey and down to the castle gates. From high above, the small army looked almost like a single creature, one of the weird little monstrosities that lived in pools along the shores of the Kinslaw, something with no guiding thought that nevertheless reached for and grasped and consumed what it needed. What were the Scythi going to make of this party of armed mortals? Would they welcome them in as the king and queen hoped, or would they avoid them as unwanted intruders? Worse still, would they see them as something more dangerous? Passivales was not happy that Prince Morgan, the heir apparent, was being sent on such a mission. Everything he had fought for since becoming Lord Chancellor, every piece of hard work and subtle negotiation, would come to nothing if the prince was lost. And yet King Simon and Queen Meriamel insisted on sending him away. It seemed so careless to Passivales, so foolish, that he was just as glad he had exiled himself to this high perch in the castle's tallest tower. Do they not understand how close they are to loss at every moment? Do they not understand how suddenly fate can take their loved ones, just sweep them away like crumbs brushed from a tablecloth? He saw a flash of dull gold below, the prince's hair, Morgan had pulled back his hood to kiss his grandmother's cheek. Pasquale felt like a thief or spy watching their private moment from above. Is that how God feels sometimes, when he watches but does nothing? Like a spy. It was a strange, disturbing thought, and Pasquale shook it off. He walked to the next window, then leaned out until he located Count Eolair, who was talking with the commander of the Erkenguard's platoon that would accompany them. Pasquale knew he would miss Eolair. The Lord Steward was someone Pasquale understood, someone who had experienced tragedy in his life and been chastened by it. Like Pasquale, Eolair recognized the power of heaven to knock down anything that a man could create, to make a mockery of all hopes and plans. And yet there was Bishop Jervis, only a few yards from Eolair, waving his censer and reciting prayers as though his reedy voice might make God himself sit up and take notice. I am angry today, Pasquale told himself. I must be careful. That is no mood in which to make decisions. But some days the old wounds simply ached, and there was nothing he could do to soothe them except to take himself away from other people. He looked up at the sky. That, at least, augured well. A few clouds blew past overhead, like sheep who had lost their flock, carried on a wind from the thrivings, but otherwise the sky was a serious, solemn blue. A single trumpet's blare wafted up from below, then several more. He watched the procession, led by the prince and Eolair, as it made its way toward the Narralaw Gate and the journey down Main Row through Urchester. How small they were already becoming. How distant. From this height he could still make out Prince Morgan, but like all the rest of the company, when he turned to look back at his home, the prince had no face. He was nothing more than an actor in all this, as they all were. As we all of us are, Pasquale thought, taking whatever role God gives us and being grateful for it without ever knowing if we are to be the hero of the story or the butt of the jest. Too much bitterness, Pasquale told himself. In fact, too much thinking. He had work to do. The Lord Chancellor turned away from the window. He did not watch as the prince, the count, and their company passed through the Hayholt gates and out into the wide, dangerous world. And that's not only the end of the chapter, that is the end of part 2, whose title I forgot. But part 3 is coming up. It's called Exiles. And then, oh, there's a map. See, I'm reading the electronic version here. There's a map. That's a familiar looking place. And I will just read the beginning of the next section because it's a poem. Bring the lute, I will sing, fashioning a song of the desolate city. The song says, border winds hurrying above the castle cold, well and pathway gone from sight, hill and grave mound crumbling. 1,000 years, 10,000 ages, all end thus. What is there to say? And that's by Pao Chow. And, oops, hang on, there's one more. Inhale, exhale, forward, back, living, dying. Arrows, let flown each to each, meet midway and slice the void in aimless flight. Thus I return to the source. And that's by Geshu Soko. Last one. This final scene I'll not see to the end. My dream is fraying. By Choko. And the next chapter will be chapter 41, Hearn's Hoard, but we will not be starting that tonight. So let me just put a bookmark on there. And with that, and let me make sure I'm still online. Jeremy says, random question, Tad. Have you read Richard Adams's Shardik? Fremer's conviction that Unver's actions have religious significance make me think of that book. Plus, people seeing animals as agents of God or gods. You know, I actually have read Shardik, although it was so long ago, I barely remember it. And I know it was well before I wrote my first fantasy novel. I suspect I read it right after I read Watership Down when I was a teenager, because I went through a Richard Adams phase and read several of his books. I don't remember it very well. I certainly don't remember it as well as Watership Down, but of course I've reread Watership Down and seen the film version a couple times, so that's not really a fair comparison. I see a couple more people have popped up. Elliot Attridge, good to see you. Tim, hello Tim, good to see you too. That's Tim Speckins. Tash showed up, said I made it near the end. So that is going to do it for me. If Raziel, am I pronouncing your name correctly, Raziel? If not, please let me know somewhere in the comments. And who else did I not get a chance to say hello to? Dina Andrea. So anyway, hello to you guys too. Sorry I missed you at the beginning of the show, but I can only read the names that show up for me. And my battles with Facebook are legendary. Legendary, I tell you. Anyway, thank you so much for being with me again, spending some time. It is now 8:01, so I am going to wrap it up, call timeout. Overtime, but not for long. Be good to yourselves. That's always the first step. You got to take good care of yourself, but then you got to spread that love around a little bit. Take good care of your friends and family. Very important. But family can be whatever you make a family out of. So it doesn't have to be just the people who are your blood relations. Yeah, I hope, like me, you get along really well with the people who are your blood relations. But even if you don't, you make your own family, that's good too, and you got to take care of them as well. And you have a little spare energy. You got a little leftover oomph. There's probably people all around you that could use some help, even if it's just a smile, greeting, checking in on them every now and then. You see one of your neighbors and go, hey, how you doing? Everything all right? You look a little troubled or a little tired. Can I help you carry that? You know, just stuff like that. Anyway, so with that, I say, ciao, Bambini. I will be back next week, as far as I know. It will now be April. Wow. God, this goes by fast, this life. I will be back next week, same times I expect as usual. Till then, all of you, stay safe, peace, and I'll see you soon.